Hello.
How are you? Welcome again. Happy Thursday. Thanks so much for being here. This is Chubb to my left. Hopefully some of you recognize him. Did everybody watch their video? Show of hands. Yep, perfect. If you didn't, you're doing it tonight because you will want to, I guarantee you. But anyway, thanks so much. John is an old dear friend and someone who, as we discussed the other night, has had a formidable impact on everything all of you are doing today in many, many ways. And we haven't been able to quite do it justice yet, but I think that this hour or so will reveal a lot of interesting things, and he'd love you to participate. So continue to use the chat function if you have questions. I think that I will let him tell you how he wants to handle it. You all have his bio and his information, but I'm going to turn it over to him and kind of move off to the background. So again, welcome.
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you all for joining. And please do pop in with questions via chat or hand raising or whatever works best. I don't want to provide a monologue. It's a treat for me to be able to talk in part about a book that Terry Moe and I wrote 25 years ago. It's hard to believe that it's been that long, but you know, that's the way time goes. Looking at some of the faces on the screen, you have no idea what I'm talking about. We're infants 25 years ago. But the book is something that Terry and I, over time, have been very proud to see its influence. I should tell you that even now, in 2015, when I'm out speaking publicly, at the end of my remarks, it's not uncommon for somebody to come up to me and say, "Oh, you're the Chubb of Chubb and Moe. I had to read your book in graduate school." And it's always, you know, I had to read your book, but you know, they mean it as a compliment. But it was not long ago. This is absolutely true. You would never make anything as macabre up as this. But somebody came up to me and to pay me that same kind of compliment and said, "Oh, you're the Chubb of Chubb and Moe. You're the author of Politics, Markets, and America's Schools. I didn't realize you were still alive." This is true. This is true. So that didn't make me feel particularly young, at the very least. So I'm happy to talk about and the power of ideas. So let me take you back. That makes me feel so old. No. So let me take you back to the 1980s. I basically think the way that decisions get made in the political process and in education generally is based on power politics. You know, whoever has the money and the influence to shape elections and get people elected, they're the ones that tend to win, and it's generally not about ideas. But every now and then, ideas have a chance to win out. And the 1980s, in retrospect, were pretty unusual. The 80s got started with an idea, really, in the education space, and that was the idea that was put forth in A Nation at Risk. And I'm guessing that you already have discussed or have some familiarity with that. That was the Reagan administration's report that wasn't necessarily meant to be anything, but it used language coming from a range of experts from all different from all sorts of fields that basically said, you know, folks, while nobody really has been paying close attention, the quality of the American education system, K-12, has slipped to an also-ran in comparison to other nations in the world. And in fact, if what has happened to us was done by a foreign power, we would have regarded it as a hostile act, as an act of war. That's how bad things are. You know, the achievement of our kids doesn't come close to measuring up. Even the achievement of our top kids doesn't come close to measuring up. If you look at the requirements in our high schools, they're lackluster, and so forth and so on. And you know, in a field that education that was sort of sleepy at the time, this report captured people's imagination, and suddenly, you know, whether you were in the establishment or a union or there wasn't a reform movement to speak of, this was like a big deal. And people, I think, were genuinely concerned. Political leaders saw as an opportunity. Not much happened in Washington, but in the state capitals, some of the young governors at that time, like Bill Clinton, for example, Lamar Alexander, kind of made their careers in the 1980s by saying we need to do something about the awful state of education. And throughout the 1980s, in fact, some of the things that were recommended in Nation at Risk were done. Graduation requirements from high school in particular were raised. And because this was a time of economic growth, substantial sums of money were poured into K-12 education, obviously supported by the establishment. But you know, it was clear to anybody looking at public education that we had fallen behind in what we were spending, and so money poured in throughout the 1980s, and there was excitement that we would make progress. Sadly, by the late 1980s, not that things would change overnight, but by the late 1980s, there was disappointment. And I would say there was disappointment on the part of people in both parties. There was certainly disappointment on the part of inner city communities who had been getting the worst deal for all these years because it was pretty clear that things weren't improving. And so there was an opening for fresh ideas, and one of those ideas was the idea of choice. And so Terry and I had been involved in a research project that we were one of the co-creators of the research project to understand achievement in American high schools, and also say something about the differences between public and private schools, a topic that had been addressed by Professor James Coleman and others in the early 1980s. So we had been toiling on this research project most of the time at the Brookings Institution, and just for some insight into my thinking and Terry's thinking, when we went into this research project, we had no intention of recommending the end of public education. That wasn't where we started. What we were trying to understand is, why do some schools succeed and why do other schools fail? And then to take that as far as we possibly could. And so we were doing this research mostly based in Washington, listening to the frustrations, and finally we said something that I mentioned at the beginning of the launch of the book, that if you had a chance to look at the tape, it's like a 3-hour CNN broadcast with the most kind of prehistoric graphics and everything associated with it. It's hard to believe that it looks like something from a century ago, not 25 years ago. But at any rate, the presentations by Terry and me are only 30 minutes. So you can listen to everybody if you want to subject yourself to 3 hours, but it's a pretty succinct presentation. In the beginning of the presentation, I said something that we had been in the habit of saying publicly, and then finally wrote in this book, and that is that what we need to understand today to improve our schools is not only what accounts for school performance, like what are the good schools doing and what are the unsuccessful schools doing. We have to account for something else, and we have to account for the fact that the government has been trying to improve the schools doing the things that have been recommended and actually trying to improve schools for quite some time. It's not like in the 60s and 70s, the system was busy intentionally providing bad schools. I mean, this wasn't a strategy, it just happened. So what researchers needed to be able to do was to account for not only school performance, but how is it that efforts to improve the schools were failing? How could it be that while we're trying to fix the schools, they continue to get worse? What accounts for that? And so we ended up concluding in a way that sounded very political, but it wasn't. We meant it in the most empirical kind of way. We said that the government's effort to solve the education problem are failing because at the end of the day, the government itself is the problem. And that, well, those are fighting words to people in the public school establishment. And we didn't mean it with any offense. We were trying to explain how things have come to work the way that they did. And I think it was the argument that we made in that regard that helped take an idea of choice, or what preceded that idea, vouchers, letting people choose private schools as well as public, and make it an idea that was more compelling. And I want to say a little bit about that because it says something about, I think, how ideas can potentially become powerful. As I said, when Terry and I began this research project, we were invisible assistant professors at Stanford. We didn't have any credibility other than the fact that we had our first jobs at Stanford, but we were not authorities, and we didn't have any ideological baggage. Neither of us had written anything that was vaguely political. And Brookings, to the extent that it had a political valence, was thought of as a liberal think tank, but mostly it was thought of as a think tank with lots of serious scholars. And it had been on the left and right, in fact, of major issues over the years. So Terry and I did not begin this with any cause in mind. We didn't know that there would be any reforms to be recommended from it, and so I think there was an honesty about what we tried to do that made the idea at the end of the day more believable. So with that as a little bit of background, what we did was first we said, is it possible to determine whether schools actually make a difference for student achievement? And if so, what is it that the schools are doing? Because this is an important question, because a lot of people think that actually school doesn't matter that much. What matters is your sort of inherent aptitude or what you bring to school, the influence of your family, the influence of your friends. And I've talked to a lot of frustrated educators who say, I've kind of done everything I can. This student or these students, are pretty challenging. Or in the role that I have today, working with independent schools, people will say, it's not, your schools aren't particularly good or interesting. They just happen to be educating lots of privileged kids. So what do you expect? They're successful. So we took all of that into account, and what we found, again, looking at high schools, public and private, rich and poor, and so forth, what we found was something that was really encouraging, was that schools really made a difference. After you took into account the initial aptitude of the students and peer influences and the influence of families, we found that schools made a substantial difference. There is such thing as a good school and a bad school. We really should be fighting for good schools, and we found that the influence of schools was roughly equal to a child's inherent ability. That's saying a lot. And over the course of a high school career, the difference between a good school and a bad school was a full year of achievement. And that's a lot. So as folks listened to us, they thought, well, that's pretty encouraging. There is such a thing as good schools and bad schools. And then we said, all right, so what do they look like? And what we found actually comported with what lots of education researchers and scholars and practitioners had said. We said that great schools have a clear sense of mission. They have a point of view. They know what they're trying to accomplish. Sense of mission is not the easiest thing to establish. In the independent school world, you think about a Montessori school. I mean, one that really knows what a Montessori practice looks like. That's why they're there. They have a point of view about education. So they have a clear sense of purpose. They have strong leadership, which says, goal-oriented leaders trying to get a school to a place to realize some sort of a vision. They're all about professionalism, which is to say treating educators with respect, giving them the leeway that they need to make a difference, not giving them the freedom to do whatever they want, but bringing them into decision processes, making the mission and vision of the school a collective enterprise, a place where smart people who see themselves as professionals want to teach, not an environment where you're treated like a widget and where merit's not recognized and so forth. So they have high degrees of professionalism. And then in this environment, they encourage students to pursue a program that's academically rigorous. So we laid all this out and people said, yeah, that actually sounds like what a good school looks like. And so there was buy-in to that vision. So then we asked sort of the next to us obvious question, which is, all right, well, if we all agree on this is what great schools look like, why don't we have more of them? And is there something systematic we can say about where we have them and where we don't? And we found that it's easier to have schools that have these characteristics if the kids are higher achieving, for example. But at the end of the day, we found that the most important influence on whether schools had a sense of mission, strong leadership, professionalism, and so forth, was whether they had the freedom to take responsibility for their missions themselves, whether they were free from control by central offices, by unions, by local boards of education, or their own governing board, wherever the case may be. The more autonomy there was at the school site, the more likely people were to behave like professionals and take responsibility and get the job done. And that message, by the way, also resonated. People would say, in public education, they would say, yeah, that's the problem. There's too much bureaucracy, too many rules and regulations. Teachers can't do what they think is best. Principals can't lead. We've got a system that's way too bureaucratic. We need to fix that. And, there was nobody out there at the time who was saying, oh, no, wait a minute, bureaucracy is a good thing. It was like, yeah, we're with you. So that's when the consensus began to break down, because we said, all right, so schools matter. We understand what good schools look like. We understand that bureaucracy is the #1 impediment to good schools. So why so much bureaucracy? And what are the conditions under which there isn't bureaucracy? So again, we looked at that, taking into account all of the different circumstances, and we found that, well, if you're in an environment that's homogeneous, that is where there's basically one point of view that's shared by everybody, meaning there's not a lot of conflict, and if you're working with kids that don't have achievement issues, and you're working with well-educated parents, that under those circumstances, you don't get a lot of rules and regulations, because there's not a lot of conflict and demand that authorities do anything. And so under those circumstances, schools tend to be run in a way that provides a lot of autonomy, which then promotes professionalism. And we said, so, if you go out into the suburbs, into small school systems, You think about, I think about, Jeannie probably thinks about as well, suburban New Jersey, outside of New York City. Small school districts, they represent homogeneous communities. The parents are middle class to upper middle class. And those systems run pretty autonomously and they get pretty good results. But outside of those select communities, which are not the greatest problem areas, the demands to fix the schools lead to political conflict, which lead to one program after another trying to fix things, which are then implemented through bureaucracy. And that gets back to the government being the problem. The more the government tries to fix things, the more policies it passes, the more programs it institutes, the more bureaucracy proliferates to make it happen. It actually backfires and undermines autonomy, professionalism, sense of mission, and so forth. So, you know, you all now are living in the era of accountability and testing. And back in 1990, Terry and I said, no accountability through testing. It will distort the schools and ruin things. And then it came, and I thought, well, you know, a little bit of testing is probably okay. Now, 15 years into this era, different topic. I think it's been a total freaking disaster, derailed everything good in school reform, but it's also an illustration of what happens when the government tries to fix things from the top down. It really is. So we can talk about that later if you wish. But back to the final bit of the book's argument was that, so the public system is able to provide autonomy under only the most favorable conditions, and that's not good enough. And any efforts by the government to try to provide autonomy to the schools is going to require some measure of accountability, and that's likely to spiral out of control into a distorting mess. And I think we turned out to be correct in forecasting that. But then we said, so is there a way out? And we said, well, you know, it turns out that private schools, whether they're subject to an archdiocese, which obviously has a pretty strong point of view about how schools should run, or whether it's an independent school or wherever you find them, they tend to have a tremendous amount of autonomy at the school site, very little bureaucracy at all. And it's not a matter of philosophy. It's not that public sector people believe in bureaucracy and people in the not-for-profit, private sector don't believe in. Nobody likes bureaucracy. The difference is that in a marketplace, in order to satisfy parents who are making a choice, because school quality depends on autonomy, that the market forces institutions, whatever their view of regulation may be, to provide autonomy at the school site. I used to tell an anecdote about this, comparing the Archdiocese of New York City, which had 250,000 kids, to the New York City public school system, which had 1 million kids. These are both huge systems. And to try to understand them a little bit, I called up the New York City public school system and I wanted to know, sort of how many schools you have, how many students you have. And it took a while to find my way through the bureaucracy to get the answers. But finally I said, so how many people, work in your central office? And they said, well, we're not really authorized to give that information out, but, more being passed through the bureaucracy on the telephone. And finally somebody tells me, and it's a huge number. I can't remember the number now. It was a huge number, and it was like one central office person to every 100 students in the system. It was a lot. So then I called the Archdiocese, and I said, so, I'm in just get some sense of how you run things here, how many schools you have, how many students, and the person gave me the info and so forth. And I said, I don't know if you're going to be able to get me this, give me this number, off the top of your head, but how many people work in the central office for the Archdiocese? And she said, well, I don't have the statistic, but just a minute and I'll count them. And she wasn't making a joke. She was being dead serious, and she looked around the office and she said, I think there are about 40 of us. And that's really different. That's really different. So, getting back to how ideas can be compelling, this idea was grounded in research. It wasn't just a theory. When Milton Friedman back in the 50s proposed vouchers, it was an interesting idea, but it wasn't backed by data. So this was backed by the largest study of high schools that had ever been done. It also was grounded in findings that people found quite acceptable. Schools matter. Good schools look like this. Bureaucracy is a bad thing. So it was only at the very end, when everybody is in agreement about how things should work, that the controversy arises. And we said, if the public system is going to be better, it can't be based on top-down control. It just inherently won't work. And so we need to redesign the public system so it can be based on choice, and so that we can do everything possible to prevent the imposition of controls. And so we recommended a voucher system with, unfortunately, much less regulation than exists today. But I think that the reasons that the idea gained traction were that, as I say, it was based on a tremendous amount of research. It comported with people's sort of common sense notion of what good schools need to do. So it wasn't sort of out of left field. It was done without any political agenda whatsoever. It was undeniably helpful that it was published and publicized by the Brookings Institution, which people tended to think of as a democratic think tank, and this was thought of as a conservative idea, or at least a market-based idea. So that was kind of dog bites man story, or they used to say Nixon goes to China, but that doesn't mean anything to any of you. So, which is fine. I never thought it was that great an analogy, but it's at any rate, it was unusual for Brookings to come out and say this, and so that helped gain the idea traction. So ideas can make a difference. And as I say, it was a time when I think both sides were hungry for ideas that were different than more of the same. It was pretty clear that putting more money in wasn't going to turn things around. It was pretty clear that just raising the requirements wasn't going to get it done. The market analogy, generating a supply of new schools, not just letting people choose from the existing schools. This is one of the questions, and I think Jeannie dealt so well after this with some of the most ridiculous challenges to the idea. But the one that I always found most humorous was, he would say, okay, so you give everybody choice, what happens when the good schools fill up? So, you kind of try to maintain composure and say, well, the idea of the system is to improve schools and to bring new schools into being and to drive poor schools out of existence and to provide more choices. So, if it works, the good schools aren't going to just all fill up. If this is done right, people will have better choices. But, it's such a foreign idea, and other people would say, why do we have to give people choice? Why don't we just fix all the schools? Okay, so let me go back to square one and repeat myself. But right place at the right time, right platform, a nation, I think, hungry for ideas that would be different. So that's... Ideas really can be game changers, and I think choice was one of those ideas.
And talk about, hi guys again, talk about, so what happened when you kind of went on the road, and then also we had a discussion the other night about this notion that if you give parents choices, there's some disagreement in the group whether or not parents can make the right choices without all that accountability.
Right. So, there was a lot of interest in the book and the idea, and so I ended up getting a lot of invitations to speak around the country. And so I traveled quite a bit in 1990, 1991, 92. And sometimes I was asked to speak at establishment events, to public education groups, and they listened patiently. And I don't know how much of a difference it made. But I also spoke to community groups and to other kinds of organizations that were genuinely interested in new ideas. And I think that one of the most important things that happened in being out speaking about this in the States, as opposed to Washington — politics are different in Washington — was that in a lot of communities around the country, in inner cities, there was a real hunger for being able to do something different. This wasn't an academic issue. This wasn't something that Washington could get to when it was good for, a presidential agenda or something, or when it, found a nice niche in a State of the Union address. In the communities, in the states, people were desperate. The schools in the inner cities were horrible. And activists in the cities were trying to do anything to fix it. And they would have happily fixed the schools through the local public school systems if they could. But they found that they couldn't. And so they began asking questions like, why can't we send our kids to the local Catholic school? What would be so bad about that? It's a better school. It's a safer school than the public schools that our kids are being forced to go to. And then we began talking about a new system and the idea of charters. Yeah, why do we have to bus our kids from the inner city out to the suburbs thinking that that's the only place that good schools could be? What if we created some new good schools in the inner city? And what happened pretty rapidly was that inner city folks, African Americans, Hispanics in particular, began to see choice as a solution for their frustrations. They also began to see it as a matter of equity. As many of us have pointed out, Jeannie very much included, this country has always thought it was just fine to be able to choose a school by moving to a better neighborhood, which sounds like a horribly inequitable way to set up a system of education. It's not that we don't have choice in the public system, it's that we have choice for people who have the ability to buy a home in a better neighborhood. Just saying those words sounds horrible. Like, how could we run a system like that? But we do. And then, of course, being the land of liberty, if you want to pay for a private school, of course, you're free to do that too. So what both of these things say is, no, as a nation, we actually believe in choice, but only if you can afford it. And that's just horrible. And so what emerged pretty quickly was that this wasn't an academic campaign. This was a matter of equity and justice for families and communities that were being badly served by the system. And so pretty quickly, grassroots support for various forms of charter schools began to spring up. Now, people would have also liked, inner city people would have been happy to choose a private school too. But as a practical matter, as support began to build up in these communities, and the powers that be had to strategize about what to do. If you're running the public, if you're running these big public systems with billions and billions of dollars and all kinds of jobs at stake, you're saying, all right, no vouchers, no money leaving the public system, but maybe we can design one of these charter systems or whatever they call them. Maybe we can design one of them that provides people enough choice so that they'll simmer down, but we can, maybe we can underfund them and we can tie one of their hands behind their backs impose just enough regulations to screw them up, and we'll get down that path. And I think that's probably actually what was said behind closed doors. So, so the establishment began to view charters as a more acceptable path to provide choice to people who were demanding it, to vouchers. And by 1991, the first voucher bill was passed in Minnesota, as I recall. Charter bill, I'm sorry, charter bill was passed in Minnesota, as I recall, and under the leadership of a Democratic governor, Rudy Perpich, just a little known person from history, yeah, very influential, but it was important that a Democratic governor led the way. And then slowly other states began to come on board, and then boy, by the mid-1990s, they began to fall like dominoes. And the Center for Education Reform, Jeannie can explain its genesis obviously better than anybody, but the center and its creators, Jeannie at the center of that, recognize that the action education is not in Washington. It's all around the country. And there was a hunger on the part of communities of all types for guidance and information about how to do these things. And so it wasn't Washington that seized upon the idea aggressively. I mean, there was a little bit of it. Lamar Alexander had a program to seed research and development around new school models, and there was some tangible products of that. But most of the action getting charter bills passed was in the states, and it's been a phenomenal success story since then. I mean, lots of issues, warts, and all of that, but but the states are the ones that really seized on it.
Okay, so thank you, and I could listen to that for a long time because there's so much more to it. But I see a question, a couple of them. I'm going to go to Laura. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, I just wanted to get some ideas based on your information and ideas about good teachers and good schools. Can you speak to your ideas about how accountability without standardized testing can take place? What other options do you consider to be really useful tools for assessing that accountability?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think that the basic idea, I think, in good charter systems is that a school ought to have the opportunity to propose what it aims to do and propose what evidence it's going to produce to show that it is doing that, and then be held accountable for what it promises. 2 years ago, I became president of the National Association of Independent Schools. So that's a couple thousand. There are about 3,000 independent schools. They're sectarian, non-sectarian, but they're distinguished from other kinds of private schools by having their own governing board. So by definition, they're autonomous at the school level. The kids in secondary independent schools take the SAT. They apply for college. They get in or they don't get in to wherever they want to go. At the lower levels of the schools, use standardized testing at their discretion to diagnose how students are doing. But the schools have lots of different purposes. So you have Waldorf schools that are wanting to see students develop in a particular way because they believe that that's natural. You have Montessori schools that have a view about student development and about how they should be taught and about when it's important to master particular skills. You have progressive schools that think it's incredibly important for students to be able to connect their work to the real world. And they want to be judged on how well students are able to do that. They want the students to be able to read and write as well, and they take responsibility for that. And then there's, the entire non-cognitive domain. I mean, every school, public or private, wants kids to develop with a sense of confidence and with self-esteem and with a community conscience and a desire to serve more than themselves, and not, and to recognize that happiness doesn't lie in selfish pursuits, but lies in, in serving and helping others. Schools have specific views about what it means to have good character and to become an ethical person. The list goes on and on about what schools, again, public or private, are trying to do. And in the end, I think that schools ought to have much more opportunity to present to the public what it is they do and what they're accomplishing. It may not seem, it's not as easy as saying, you all take a test, and then we'll give you a thumbs up or thumbs down based on that. And we don't care what you think about the pace at which kids learned or anything else. That's tough, right? Because this is easier for us, the accountability people, which is, it's just like, well, this is the only thing that's practical. So it's messy. It's messy to allow schools to state their missions and then present evidence that they're accomplishing them. But ultimately, I think it's a better system. The final thing I'll say about testing is that, most nations around the world have some kind of testing. But in comparison to ours, it's based on standards that are connected to the curriculum. Very importantly, it's not done every year. It's done at critical junctures. Often it's not just confined to reading and math, but it's about other subjects that matter. So it's vastly different than what we've done now. Limiting it to a couple of subjects, having standards of passing that are really low. I mean, these tests don't matter to suburban schools or to competent schools, but what they do is they force so many of the schools to think about only one thing. So that's the danger of it. I think that we could have testing, and in fact, as I said, in independent schools, you don't have to administer tests, but you do in order to ensure that you're doing a good job, but you get to choose the test that you think best fits what you're doing. And then at the end of the day, you still have to take the SAT or the ACT, and nobody likes them particularly, but you recognize that, that's kind of the coin of the realm for getting into college. And so, you deal with it, but it doesn't distort 13 years of education.
So there's a couple of great questions pending, but I'm going to take executive privilege here because it relates to what we're talking about throughout the class. And given what you just said about really the intention, okay, John, was it really wasn't intended for these school organizations, these new systems, to be straddled by tests. Or, one of the things we hear a lot, and I think that all of us quote unquote suffer from it, or perhaps are exposed to it in a way that we think the charters and choice programs were supposed to be brought into existence only to be better. Mm-hmm. And if they're not definitively better by an objective standard, quote unquote objective, then they're not any good. And you're raising an interesting question that we've debated, which is there an objective standard, number one? What did the tests actually show? And was the point to be better for everyone, better according to the government, better according to mom? Like, what is that better we strive for? And just even if you look at the Twitter debate that some of us were in last night with the people who don't want more charters in Philly, proponents will claim that it's all about quality. But actually, if you peel the onion back, they don't have very good quality barometers in Philly. So is it about better? Should we want that? Is there a way to say better? And what was actually the historical perspective, even if we've advanced and that was a Neanderthal thing to say?
Well, Terry and I never thought that the outcome of this would be that charters would be better. What we thought was that creating a competitive process would cause the overall quality of the system to improve. That is, that the upstart schools would have to be better, or at least have a promise to be better to bring parents to them. The district schools, to the extent that they're still run by districts, would have to step up their game in order to compete. Private schools would have to be on their toes, or they would lose paying parents to charter schools or to other schools that have now gotten better and are free. Some of which is actually happening. But the theory behind choice is that it is really that it lifts all boats, and there will be winners and losers, but anybody is free to adapt to this new system. District schools who have the advantages of proximity and loyalty in some cases, you might predict that they would win, that the charters would threaten them and then they would step up their game in the district. So anybody could win, but our point was that all schools would get better. And I think that the way you would see that is you begin looking across indicators of achievement in the country. And so you might look at NAEP and see what's happening with that. Is that improving overall? You might look at college attendance rates, college completion rates, earning of BAs. There's lots of things that you could look at, but it's really the system that ultimately, it's the system that's the test of this,
Okay, so you've got a whole bunch of questions here. Hillary, who's up here in your right of the screen. Let me try to unmute her. Hillary, why don't you go ahead and take your question. Sorry.
Okay, you were talking about parents having choice, and one of the things that you mentioned in your talk was schools having choice, and I think at the time they were thinking more of private schools, but now we have these charter schools. So schools being selective of students, not necessarily based on, as long as it wasn't discriminatory, but
right,
based on students. So how do you view that now? Do you still have that same view?
Yeah, I know that the charter systems, in order to be politically acceptable, all went to lottery admissions. I don't think that really is right. I think that schools that get to chart their own mission, get to choose their own missions, ought to be able to say which students are the best fit for that. If you have a competitive market, schools find their niche. It's not like you can open your charter school and say, well, our standards are going to be like Harvard. What if there isn't a market? What if there isn't a market for any more Harvard-oriented schools? You have to decide where you fit. And I think that we get into trouble when we say to educators, all right, you come up with a school concept that is going to work for kids, and then we're going to randomly assign you kids. I mean, we wouldn't do that with a school for the performing arts, I don't think, and we recognize that if you're going to have a high school math charter, that it's okay to have admissions requirements, because if you don't know math, or what if you don't even like math, right? That it's really not the right place for you. So I think ultimately it is a mistake that for schools not to be given that kind of opportunity.
So Bridget, who's over here on your left, John, says, do you need to create a market to ensure all students are served? In that case, what happens if the student's not served? And I'll let her speak for herself.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, just that some students obviously more resource intensive potentially to serve, or there might not be an incentive for them to be served. So how do you deal with that in that kind of a system?
Yeah, I mean, what we recommended at the time, and what I still recommend, is that students should be resourced based on their needs. And so if a student has high needs that are obviously identifiable, then that student should be much better resourced. And if students are appropriately resourced, and there will be schools that want to serve them. I mean, it's interesting to me. Way back when, I spent a lot of time learning about private schools, but it's only in the last 2 years that I've worked with them, and I've been kind of blown away by the large number of schools for kids with learning differences, and they exist because special education still remains a weakness in the public schools, and these schools have been created to meet that need. So it's just an example, but kids should be resourced based on their needs, and if that happens, schools are much more likely to serve them. The other thing I'll say is that, and we said this in the book, is that there needs to be some sort of a fail-safe procedure. Kids are not without schools, so citywide choice systems actually work this way. So kids get to choose one, get to list their first 3 choices, and if they don't get into their first 3 choices by lottery, there's always kids left over, then those kids are assigned, and all schools that participate have to receive kids. So if you're a charter school that is otherwise getting to select kids that you think are mission appropriate, but at the end of the day, because you're participating in the system, there may be 5 or 10 kids or whatever that didn't get their choice, and they're now your responsibility, and they're your responsibility.
So Candace is asking, where are you, Candace?
Hi.
Hi, you're not on camera, is that right?
I'm here. Can you see me?
Sorry, there you are. You were a little dull. I couldn't see you. So you're talking about SES and government monitoring and kids getting left behind.
Yes. Good evening. How are you, Dr. Chubb?
Very well.
Good. Just a quick question. I know that me and another student, we had some of the same concerns. We were kind of speaking around it a little bit. But in your findings, do you think that the charter schools and some of the private schools are kind of held to the same expectations as your regular school districts? Is the accountability the same, do you think?
I think I think charter schools and public schools I think the standards through testing are basically identical. If you're a public school, it doesn't matter whether you're a charter or a district school. You have to meet these standards. You have to, go into needs improvement status. You can be put on probation. Now there's waivers, so and everybody gets waived into the system. So there's no real difference there. Charter schools are subject to the oversight of their authorizers. And what does happen in charter schools that's different than district schools is that they will be closed. And I'm guessing there've probably been 1,000 charter schools closed at this point in the history of charter schools. So that's a lot of school closures, and that doesn't happen in districts very much. So I tend to think that charter schools are ultimately held to higher standards. Yeah, they don't have to follow the same rules and regulations, but at the end of the day, they're much more likely to be taken out of business by the government. Private schools are subject almost completely to the tests of the market. They have to be accredited or licensed, but that's a much more liberal process than happens for public schools. But they're subject to market tests. And one statistic that kind of blows people away who don't know anything about private schools is that the number of students in private schools over the last decade has declined not just decline in percentage, but does decline in absolute numbers from 6 million to 5.2 million. And research on that has shown that most of that loss in students has been to charter schools. And that's just parents voting with their feet, saying, whatever I had to pay in tuition, I don't think it quite measures up to what the charter schools are doing. And New Orleans is a great example of that. New Orleans pre-Katrina had a horrible public school system that nobody attended unless they were too poor to go to a Catholic school or an independent school. Today, the charter schools have risen in quality substantially, and they're pulling lots and lots of students away from private schools. And that's kind of the way it should work.
So, Matt, why don't you jump in here? But there's also, John, if you want to look, kind of an interesting debate you guys are having. I should unmute you all and let you have it about whether Howard districts close, why they close, why schools close, whether or not parents and should be the ultimate market test. Go for it, Matt.
Sure.
And Matt, why don't you do me a favor? Since you're actually participating in this discussion, just because we can't read and talk at the same time, because we're old. Sum up what you're reading over here. Sum up what you think is going on in this discussion and kind of what you've heard, as well as kind of throw your question out, because it's a very diverse group of thoughts and questions.
Oh, okay. So summing up what the kind of the chat going on over here, I think that there's been a lot about. Now you're asking me to go back and read, and I was looking through my questions. So this talk about, there was some about the, you're putting, George, I know, had some good comments in here specifically about the school buildings and it not needing to be physically a space, but about the education of it. And then what happens then when we're closing schools. We talked about the charters that had just recently been closed. What's happening though with the districts and them not closing if they're due to failure? So how are we holding district space accountable for that? I'm not doing justice to the comments that are going on in here because I think people have actually posted some really good things. I'll put my question in here and then I'll let anybody else chime in if they want. But mine was around this idea of the decentralized system and what would be the worst case scenarios? Like, what did opponents fear the most? And have you seen a change in that from when you first published your results to where we are now?
I know her brother.
Yeah, let me just skip right to the last part of this. There was a lot of fear mongering. Maybe it was with the best of intentions, but I think that there was just a lot of fear mongering, that said the charter schools would only educate the best kids because they're the only parents who would be capable of making choices. Charter schools wouldn't end up serving the kids who were most in need. Charter schools would be created by religious and political extremists who would undermine our democracy and the role that public schools play in bringing us all together, and so forth. And none of that really has come to pass. The charter schools have largely come to serve the communities who are most in need. People who are happy in their schools don't choose to leave. It's the people who are most in need that make the choice to leave. People don't go to a charter school because they're happy or they want to go from good to great. That's not what's happening. So I think that our projections of others that said, if we open up a system to more choice, the people who are most in need will choose, and the supply will gravitate, not to the suburbs where people aren't hankering for choice, but to the places where there's the greatest need. And I think that that's turned out to be true. And I think that that's I think it's a very, very positive thing.
Hi, my name is Jordan, and I am a student at Bard College in upstate New York. And I just wanted to read a quick quote to you and then ask you a follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
So it says, the U.S. Constitution grants no authority over education to the federal government. Education is not mentioned in the Constitution of the United States, and for good reason. The founders wanted most aspects of life managed by those who were closest to them, either by state or local government, or by families, businesses, and other elements of civil society. Certainly, they saw no role for the federal government in education. So my question is, going off of that point, you're talking about how bureaucracy is the #1 impediment to education reform. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if it would be a good sort of reform effort to sort of get the federal government not involved. And what if education was paid for instead of getting taxed by the government and like the government handling all that money? What if it was just, it was like everyone should go to school, but it should be more of a decision by the parents. Like also parents give their money to different schools, or have teachers who just really want to teach, who go out and create schools that are dynamic and are attractive, sort of like a free market. So education is more of a thing that then it'll feel more, people will value it more instead of it just being, oh, it's here, people have jobs, you know, go to school. It's something that, because it's like, if I buy something, I'm wanting to keep it, I'm wanting to use it. But if it's there, I mean, I might use it, I might not. Doesn't matter how nice it is.
That's right. That's right. Well, I mean, these are very, very important fundamental questions. Just really quickly, the federal government, notwithstanding No Child Left Behind, has mostly played a much smaller role in education than anybody else. It gets a lot of headlines, but just one measure, the federal government provides about 7 or 8% of all the dollars that are spent in public schools. So it's pretty small. The reason they're involved at all constitutionally is that when it comes to the funding, schools don't have to receive it if they don't want. And so if they don't want the money, then they don't have to abide by the regulations. Schools unfortunately need the money, so they abide by the regulations. But most of education is done at the state and local level. What is unnecessary is the development of these huge school systems providing education directly for free. There's a very important argument why it's not just left to the families, and that is that education is a private good. That is, if you go to school, you benefit as an individual, and you will have a better life for that. But it's also a public good, and that is that society has an interest in seeing that everybody is well educated beyond what individual people may want. And so it's an economist would call it a mixed good. And so, that's why the government, theoretically, why the government's involved at all. What Terry and I argued is that, yes, it is a public and a private good. And so what the government should do is fund it, but provide lots of options in how people consume it. There's a big difference when you're told, okay, you have a scholarship or a voucher or an entitlement to go somewhere. We're not going to tell you where to go, but don't waste it, right? Don't waste it by making a bad choice. The way the system currently works is your child turns 4 or 5 and you receive a letter saying, you live at the corner at 20th and M, and so here's your school. Report there the day after Labor Day. And so, that it really takes your volition out of the equation. So from the perspective that you were raising, Terry and I were saying, yes, the government should fund this, should make it possible for everybody, but people should have real skin in the game to have to make decisions about how to use this, this really dear resource, this, opportunity to go to school.
So, Kate, you want to throw in the last question? I think it's really interesting because some of this chatter was really, and Kate was part of that, and you're unmuted now, was about charters and the condition we find them in, which look, whether we see the full extension of the theory in politics, markets, and American schools or not, there's no question that it did ignite this movement and this discussion about choice and the activity that many of you are involved in. So one of the things I also want you to take away from this after is, so what happens when you actually do put out the great and the big ideas, right? You actually might get something that you like, even if it sounds kind of crazy in the end of the day. So Kate, and then Greg, if you've got any final thoughts, go for it.
Sure. Can everybody hear me first?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I was saying earlier that I've done some work with Ted Coldery, who, for those who don't know, was a really instrumental person in the Minnesota charter school movement, and he's still really involved in Minnesota and nationally. But he speaks a lot about the origin of charters being something that was to really allow teachers and communities the opportunity to have authority and autonomy to design schools that would bring innovation in education and really drive student improvements in student outcomes through that. And so from that perspective, now we have, just hundreds or thousands of charter schools across the country, and some of them seem to have success and found formulas that work for students, and some obviously have not. So I'd just love your thoughts on that philosophy behind using charters as this change agent for innovation, and has that really been something that has worked for families and for students, or is it something that was lost overall in like this charter movement and around school choice in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think ultimately you're going to get much more innovation if you have a competitive market-based system. So we always need to ask, okay, charters compared to what? Because the system pre-charters was not exactly a font of innovation. I think that the issue over the last 20 years is that, in large part, is that there's never been a level playing field. The funding of charter schools rarely measures up to what public schools get. They are almost invariably in substandard facilities, in places that public schools have abandoned or wouldn't want to be located in. As for teacher or educator started charter schools, and there are many, educators need to be willing to work in conditions that are substandard. Sort of recognizing that sort of the physical amenities and the physical comforts that they could get in a public education system are likely not to be quite there. They're not going to be able to staff the school perhaps exactly the way they want because they don't have the resources. And so, what I'm saying is that the rules of the charter system have been stacked against the charter schools, and that's because it's a political process. And so charter advocates say, look, we'd rather have some law than no law, and so we accept the constraints. But those constraints make it very difficult for educators or others, who want to do the very best by kids to dive in and do it, because it's going to be a huge sacrifice. I think if there were a level playing field, including both operating expenses, capital expenses, facilities, and so forth, that you would see more of the kind of innovation that Ted and others who look at it from that angle have predicted.
Okay, Greg, last word.
Yeah, just a quick question, I guess. In Michigan, we're currently kind of being pushed. Oh, kudos to the retweet earlier, Jeannie. But we're getting pushed to over-regulate charters, and we have a really, really restrictive Blaine Amendment. So pushing to get that taken out of the Constitution would be a really hard step. So is there any tips or anything you have, like advice, is making the argument for less regulation without saying less regulation, I guess, because it's not going over well? The Detroit Free Press is like very, very, very adamant about charter schools are wasting $1 billion a year. They are ultimate failures in the state. And they have multiple groups that are now pushing the same argument. And we're constantly hearing it again and again and again.
And John, you might also comment on how the press looked back 20 years ago and when there was any before there were charters. It sounds familiar even when there weren't.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, the press was very much on the side of the establishment. It was hard to find mainstream press that supported the idea, even though they, hated bureaucracy, knew the politics was a problem, knew there were inequities. But most of the mainstream press basically thought all of this was somehow still fixable within the system. The arguments that I think are ultimately most compelling are that charter schools are subject to short-term charters. If they don't measure up to what's been promised, they will close. It would be nice if district schools were held to the same standards. Why don't we start there? And then second, if we're going to be tough on charter schools, give them the funding, capital and operating, so that they have a chance to work with the same funding that the traditional public schools do. The resources that charter schools have, I spent once I got these ideas out there, I felt that I needed to put my money where my mouth was, and so I was recruited to help launch Edison Schools. And so, I personally was involved in the beginning of roughly 100 charter schools in a whole lot of states. And I will tell you, from painful personal experience, that the money was never what was needed to create a school like the local public schools. And it's gotten a little bit better, but it needs to change. So those are, it's hardly that the charter schools are, kind of taking more than their fair share. They're being held to a higher standard of accountability, and they're being asked to perform with less resources, and that's hardly fair.
Okay, John, any other last thoughts?
No, I just thank you all for the chance to share. I'm available. I'm available on Twitter, and I'm available by email, chubb@nas.org. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
All right, I'm going to unmute you all. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
all right, thanks again.
Bye-bye.